But first, again today in Canberra, the Albanese government was desperate to get its focus back on its 1 July handouts, but still the focus remained on the now suspended, likely soon to depart, Labor Senator Fatima Payman. Even the Prime Minister all but admitting she's got a foot out the door.
Senator Payman, of course, has made a decision to place herself outside the Labor Party. That's a decision that she made. I expect further announcements in coming days, which will explain exactly what the strategy has been over now more than a month.
There's a lot at stake in all the contention over the 29-year-old Payman, who sits in the Senate on the back of a paltry personal vote of less than 2,000 West Australians. 1,681 votes, to be exact. Obviously, there's the general issue of whether MPs should be allowed to cross the floor on matters they're passionate about, and whether the Prime Minister has bullied a junior colleague. Then there's the issue itself of whose side Australia should be on in the fight against the apocalyptic death cult, Hamas, and the liberal democratic state of Israel. And finally, there's the issue of whether MPs should vote on the basis of their religion or their judgment of what's in Australia's national interest. And I think that's the most important question of all, because the last thing this country needs is sectarian voting and MPs who think they're there to represent their faith rather than their country. Today, Liberal Susan Lee accused the Prime Minister of trying to pressure Senator Payman into towing the party line.
Have Labor Senator Fatima Payman's claims of being intimidated by members of the Labor Party been referred to the Parliamentary Workplace Support Service?
With respect to the Liberal Deputy Leader, that's nonsense. It's a party leader's job to maintain discipline, and just because Labor's discipline is extreme, more so than other parties, doesn't mean the Labor leader shouldn't try and enforce it. It is, after all, built on 130 years of Labor history. Payman knows the rules. She knew the rules when she signed up. To my mind, Anthony Albanese's failure of leadership has been less about suspending Payman for her defiance and more about his failure to make a sustained argument against the terrorist state that Gaza has become. Because regardless of whether she was supposedly exercising her conscience to do so, Payman's position in favour of recognising Palestine unconditionally and rewarding the October 7 terrorist atrocity is simply wrong. Doing what Payman insists should be done ends up rewarding Hamas and undermines our decades-long fight against terrorism. It matters to the Middle East region, and as we can see with recent incidents in Australia, it matters here at home too. Maybe Payman should have a right to cross the floor. On my side of politics, MPs have that right, and it's one of the biggest things that distinguishes the Liberal Party from Labor. But that's not the ALP way, and Payman knows it. And it seems she's a willing pawn in a high-stakes game to embarrass Labor and open up a sectarian front in this country, where people will be encouraged to vote on the basis of religious judgments rather than political ones, and on the basis of religious identity rather than an Australian identity. In crossing the floor, Payman was showing solidarity with the people of Gaza, not the people of Australia. In other words, she's not thinking as an Australian who happens to be of Afghan Muslim background. She's thinking as someone for whom religious solidarity is the key consideration. But she's not alone. As discussed here last night, a group called the Muslim Vote is trying to get Muslim Australians to vote as Muslims, not as Australians, who just happen to have a particular religion. This mob have even called for candidates to run against Labor ministers Jason Clare, his electorate is 32% Muslim, and Tony Burke, whose electorate is 25% Muslim. Like the Teals, only on the basis of religion rather than climate, they want to punish the incumbent political party and force it to change position by threatening to roll its sitting MPs. If all the Muslims heed this advice, a religious vote could indeed unseat those ministers. The Muslim Vote insists that it's not all about religious fanaticism. They say they're worried about issues other than Gaza. But a like-minded Islamist body in Britain has published a series of demands like Sharia-compliant banking, essentially that Muslims should be treated differently because of their religion. And a like-minded group here, called Muslim Votes Matter, also insists that, and I quote, will cover a broad range of issues, before stating it will, and I quote again, highlight the most pertinent issue the Australian Muslim community faces, currently being Australia's foreign policy response to the growing atrocities in Gaza. Now, do you really think the most important issue for Australian Muslims is not what's happening here, but what's happening 10,000 miles away? So here's the crux of the problem. Islam doesn't really recognise the separation of church and state. So it's very hard for serious Muslims not to decide things on a religious basis rather than a national interest one. And the fact that Fatima Payman is reportedly talking to the notorious preference whisperer Glenn Drury, who's famous for turning tiny numbers of votes into disproportionate influence in the parliament, suggests that it's only a matter of time before we have religious parties and a Muslim first, Australia's second sort of candidate in the Senate. And that is this Prime Minister's real failure. Not to stand up for Australian values and for the Australian way of making decisions, because he's scared of losing Muslim votes in Western Sydney. Now, it's weak. It is so weak. And yet again shows why we have a bloke in the lodge who is simply not up to it.